Stefan Norris noticed the smell before anyone else did. It was barely 8:15 on a Tuesday morning in October, and the grand ballroom of the Vantage Hotel was already filling with the kind of people who wore name badges that cost more to print than Stefan earned in a day. The Health Forward Summit, Canada's largest annual conference for pharmaceutical executives, hospital administrators, and government health policy directors, had taken over the entire hotel for 3 days. Stefan had been hired on a short-term contract to oversee the supplemental electrical systems and ventilation backup equipment installed specifically for the event. He was 41, broad across the shoulders, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and the particular stillness of a man who had learned that working quietly was the only kind of working nobody ever interrupted. His contractor's vest was faded from 2 winters of outdoor sites, and the laminated badge clipped to his chest identified him as temporary technical support, the polite term hotels used for men they needed but preferred not to acknowledge. Stefan crouched beside a circulation grate near the service corridor junction and pressed the back of his hand against the airflow. The air coming through was warmer than it should have been, and it was moving in the wrong direction. He pulled a strip of fine tissue from his vest pocket and held it near the vent. It bent inward. He stood, followed the duct line toward the loading bay at the rear of the building, and found what he suspected. The diesel backup generator installed for the event had been positioned close. Too close to a secondary air intake that fed directly into the ballroom. The exhaust deflector was angled away from the main entrance, but the repositioning had brought the pipe within 2 meters of the intake louver. That morning, with the wind coming off the lake in the wrong direction, the generator's exhaust was being drawn into the building. Stefan entered the readings into the hotel's facility management tablet, marked the condition as critical, and called the operations line. No one answered. He left a message and walked toward the registration desk. Victor Kessler found him first. Victor was the Health Forward Summit's VP of Operations, a compact man in his late 50s with silver-streaked hair, a charcoal blazer tailored to fit his particular brand of authority, and the expression of someone who had spent decades treating inconvenience as a personal insult. He was managing 3 conversations at once when Stefan intercepted him near the exhibitor entrance. Stefan kept his explanation simple. The backup generator's exhaust was feeding the ballroom's air supply. The vent sensors near the stage appeared to be offline. He recommended shutting the generator down for a proper inspection before guests filled the room. Victor looked at Stefan's faded vest. He looked at the laminated badge. He did not look at the facility tablet Stefan held toward him. He said the generator had been positioned by the hotel's contracted engineering firm and had cleared inspection that morning. He said the summit had 400 registered attendees, a live national broadcast feed, and a keynote speaker who had flown in from Ottawa. He said temporary contractors did not have authority to make recommendations that could affect a $2.4 million event. Stefan said this was not a recommendation. He said it was a safety concern with documented readings, and he was asking for 10 minutes to relocate the exhaust line or shut the unit down. Victor's voice dropped to the register men use when they want to sound controlled while communicating threat. He told Stefan that if he raised the issue again before the keynote concluded, the hotel would have no further use of his company's services. Stefan held his gaze for a moment, then nodded and walked back to the service corridor. He sent a second written notice through the facility system. He sent a third. He attempted to reactivate the sensor array near the stage, but his access code returned a permission error. He noted the error in the log, kept his carbon monoxide detector inside his vest pocket, and returned to his station at the rear of the ballroom. By 9:15, the room was full. Alma Bozalel took the stage to a standing ovation. She was the founder and executive director of the Meridian Health Alliance, and this was her 3rd consecutive year as the summit's opening speaker. She wore a steel blue blazer and spoke without notes, her voice carrying easily over the 400 people who had come to hear her outline a national proposal for integrated emergency medical response. She was exactly the kind of person a room like that was built for. Stefan stood near the service door at the back, checking the pocket detector beneath the edge of his vest. The reading was climbing. The first signs were easy to miss. A server paused beside the beverage station and placed one hand flat on the linen-covered table. A man in the 3rd row pressed 2 fingers against his own forehead, as if checking for a fever he hadn't expected. A woman near the center aisle removed her lanyard and touched her throat. Stefan moved toward the nearest vent, felt the air current, and watched the number on his detector rise past the first warning threshold. He turned toward the security cordon and told the nearest officer the ballroom had a carbon monoxide problem and the room needed to begin clearing. The officer said the keynote was live on the national feed and that Stefan didn't have clearance to access the event floor during broadcast. On stage, Alma Bozalil stopped speaking. She stopped not the way speakers stopped when they lost their place. She stopped the way people stopped when the ground shifted beneath them. Her right hand gripped the podium and the audience watched her expression change from confusion to something more alarming. She tried to continue. She said one word and then her knees gave. The room came apart. Doctors in the audience moved first, security moved second. Victor Kessler, who had been standing at the side of the room watching the broadcast monitor, began shouting for someone to call an ambulance and for the camera operators to cut the feed. Several guests near the front began coughing. An exhibitor near the back stumbled sideways into his display stand. Stefan already had his detector in his hand. He pushed through the cordon and announced clearly, loudly enough that it carried over the noise, that this was not a medical emergency. It was a ventilation failure, and the entire room was being affected. People needed to move toward the exits immediately in order and away from the loading bay at the rear of the building. Renee Dussault reached him before anyone else. Renee was the summit's head of security, a tall woman with cropped dark hair, a scar along her left jawline from an incident she never discussed, and the practiced calm of someone who had cleared rooms before. She had been watching Stefan from the moment Alma collapsed, tracking the way he moved while everyone else reacted, and she had seen him check the detector before anyone on stage showed symptoms. She grabbed his arm, not aggressively, urgently. She asked him what was happening. He told her carbon monoxide from the generator exhaust feeding through the secondary intake, staging area sensors offline, no warning system active. She needed to get people out through the front corridor and away from the east wing. Renee did not ask why a man in a contractor's vest was telling her how to run her evacuation. She had spent 20 years learning to recognize the difference between people performing competence and people exercising it. She turned to her team and relayed the instructions in exactly the order Stefan had given them. Victor stepped between them. With people coughing and moving toward exits behind him, with Alma Bozalil motionless on the stage 30 meters away, Victor looked at Stefan and told the room, loudly enough for the doctors crouching beside Alma to hear, that the temporary contractor had been interfering with restricted systems all morning and was not authorized to direct an evacuation. Stefan did not respond to that. He stepped around Victor and climbed onto the stage. The two physicians who had reached Alma first were preparing to use the AED from the wall-mounted kit near the podium. Stefan crouched beside them and asked for her pulse. One doctor checked and confirmed it was present. Rapid, irregular, but there. Stefan said she did not need the defibrillator. He said the arrhythmia they were seeing was a hypoxic response, and shocking her while she still had a spontaneous rhythm would destabilize it further. She needed oxygen and a clear airway, not electricity. The older of the two physicians told him to stand back. Stefan said her symptoms were consistent with everyone else in the room, location-dependent, progression rate-dependent, and the cause was environmental, not cardiac. He asked them to look at the people collapsing across the floor and consider whether this looked like a single patient or a room. They looked. Renee arrived at the stage with a portable oxygen kit from the emergency station near the exit. She handed it to Stefan and said Alma had been standing under the center vent for 40 minutes. Stefan took the kit, confirmed Alma's airway, fitted the mask, and adjusted the flow rate. Alma's breathing was shallow and wrong. He monitored it, made a small adjustment to her position, and waited. Beside him, one of the physicians began checking the guests who had been helped to the floor nearby. The other watched Stefan with the careful attention of someone recalibrating. Behind them, Renee coordinated the room evacuation with a quiet efficiency that kept things from becoming a crush. She moved the room in sections, kept the aisles clear, and sent 2 officers to the generator controls with Stefan's instruction relayed verbatim. Victor followed her, still insisting the generator had passed inspection and that someone needed to call the certification firm before shutting anything down. Renee told him the generator was being shut down, that the air quality data was already documented, and that she would need him to step back. He did not step back. She told him a second time, and something in the way she said it made him step back. Cold October air was coming in through the open lobby doors, and Stefan could feel the ventilation beginning to shift. Alma's chest rose more evenly. The monitor showed the same unsteady rhythm, but she was breathing. He kept one hand near her neck and watched the numbers. 3 minutes later, her breathing stopped. The physician beside Stefan said it quietly and reached for the defibrillator. Stefan said she still had a pulse. He tilted her head, opened her airway, and supported her breathing while the physician maintained the oxygen supply. The room around them had gone strangely still. The evacuation continued, but the people still near the stage were watching without speaking. He kept a count in his head. He did not rush and did not pause. He breathed for her and waited, and 2 minutes later, Alma Beozalel inhaled on her own, ragged gasping, but hers. The monitor shifted. One of the physicians said her oxygen saturation was coming up. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then the older physician asked who Stefan was. Renee answered before he could. She said he was the person who had tried to shut down that generator 3 times before the keynote started, and that if anyone wanted to discuss his qualifications, they could do it after the paramedics arrived. Stefan walked back through the ballroom and into the service corridor to account for the backstage staff. He found a catering assistant seated on the floor against the prep kitchen wall, conscious but barely. A sound technician was at the far end of the corridor, leaning against the door to the broadcast room. Stefan gave the assistant the emergency kit from his vest and guided the technician toward the exit himself, one arm across the man's back while he found his footing. By the time they reached the lobby, Stefan's own breathing had become difficult in the way that meant the exposure had caught up with him. He set the technician down near the doors and told him not to go back inside. Then he turned and went back inside. The second sweep took 7 minutes. He found one more worker, a young event staff member who had been in a side storage room and had not heard the evacuation. She was confused and frightened, but standing. Stefan walked her out and handed her to the paramedics who had arrived at the main entrance. He was sitting on the curb outside the Vantage Grand's east entrance, oxygen mask over his face and his faded vest soaked through when Tatum found him. His daughter was 11 years old and should have been in school, but the school was 12 minutes away, and she had seen the news alert on the common room television and had gotten on the transit bus without telling anyone. She pushed through the emergency cordon because she was small enough that no one thought to stop her, and she dropped to her knees on the sidewalk beside him and grabbed his arm with both hands. Stefan pulled the mask down and told her he was fine. She looked at him the way 11-year-olds look at their parents when they already know that's not the whole truth, and he put the mask back on and let her hold his arm. Neither of them moved for a long time. The paramedics released Stefan after 2 hours of observation. His CO exposure levels were higher than any other person who had been in the building. He had been the last one out twice. The attending physician said it twice also, as if making certain it was noted somewhere. Victor Kessler used those 2 hours carefully. By the time Stefan walked out of the medical tent, the hotel's legal department had already sent a communication to his contracting firm, stating that Stefan had accessed restricted ventilation controls without authorization and had taken unilateral action during the event without following established protocols. The hotel's operations office had released a preliminary statement describing the incident as an isolated equipment malfunction complicated by unauthorized intervention from a third-party contractor. Stefan's contracting supervisor called that evening. The firm was suspending his file pending the outcome of the hotel's internal review. Stefan stood in the kitchen of the apartment where he and Tatum had lived since her mother died 3 years ago. Tatum was at the table with homework she wasn't looking at, watching him. When he set the phone down, she asked if the people from the hotel were going to do something bad. He said he didn't know yet. She said the news called the person who helped everyone an unnamed contractor. She said that should have been his name. He said it was okay. She said it wasn't. He didn't have a good answer for that, so he made dinner and they sat together and didn't talk about it anymore that night. At the hospital, Alma Beozalel woke to the kind of headache that made her feel like the room was leaning. Her compliance director, a careful and methodical woman named Brigitte Lacroix, was already in the chair beside the bed when the nurses allowed visitors. Alma asked what she'd missed. Bridget told her that Victor Kessler had called a stakeholder briefing, that the hotel was issuing statements, and that the contractor who had treated her on stage and led the backstage evacuation had been suspended pending review. Alma asked his name. Bridget said the hotel hadn't released it. Alma said to find it. Brigitte Lacroix had been in compliance work for 14 years, and she had the particular instinct of someone trained to ask why the records look the way they do, rather than simply accepting that they do. She had been in the ballroom that morning and had watched Stefan identify the problem while senior officials argued around him. The hotel's official account did not match what she had witnessed. She requested the facility management logs through the hotel's standard review channel. The response was that the logs were part of an active investigation and would be provided in due course. She requested them through the summit's co-sponsoring organization, which had independent audit rights under the venue contract. The logs that came back were incomplete. 3 flagged entries in the morning's maintenance record had been removed. Bridget cross-referenced the timestamp gaps against the system's archived notification queue and found references to reports submitted under a contractor access code that matched the badge issued to Stefan Norris. She went deeper. The ventilation sensor array near the stage showed a configuration change logged 2 hours before Stefan had arrived that morning. The change had placed 4 sensors into bypass mode. The authorization code used to make the change belonged to a facilities manager who had not worked at the Vantage Grand for 8 months. Bridget copied everything to a secure external drive and contacted Renee Dussault. That same night, someone with a keycard that should not have been active accessed the hotel's server room. The power surge that followed knocked out the emergency lighting in the east wing and locked the fire doors on the second floor. A small fire started in the cable tray near the secondary control panel. The smoke activated the sprinklers in the corridor ceiling, but not in the server room itself, because the server room had its own suppression system and it had been quietly disabled. Bridget was inside the server room with the drive and 1 technician when the doors locked. The technician went to the door. Bridget called Renee. Renee called Stefan. Stefan was standing in the parking lot of a gas station 11 blocks from his apartment, where Tatum was asleep. He listened to what Renee said. He looked at the phone in his hand and understood that returning to the hotel would make everything Victor Kessler was building against him look worse. A suspended contractor back inside the building, near the servers containing the investigation records. He asked if there was anyone else who could get there faster. Renee said the fire crews were entering through the main lobby and didn't know the service access layout. Stefan called his neighbor, a retired teacher who had watched Tatum a dozen times before, and asked if she could go over. Then he drove to the Vantage Grand and entered through the loading bay access panel he had used during his morning inspections. The East Service corridor was warm and full of the acrid smell of overheated cabling. Stefan stayed low, moved through the smoke using the layout he had memorized his first day on site, and used the release wrench from his vest to clear a jammed utility door before reaching the secondary control level. He found Bridget braced against the corner wall with her arm over the technician's shoulders, the external drive held against her chest inside a fireproof sleeve. The technician had a cut on his arm from a ceiling tile that had come down. Neither of them was in immediate danger, but the smoke in the corridor between them and the exit was thickening. Stefan guided them out the way he had come in. The technician needed support, and Stefan gave it without slowing. Outside, Renee met them at the loading bay entrance. Her body camera had been recording since she'd arrived. One of the men hired to access the server room had been stopped by a police officer near the east parking exit. He had panicked when the fire spread past what he had expected, and when the officer asked him what he was doing near the service entrance at midnight, he had said more than he meant to. He admitted, with Renee's camera recording from 12 feet away, that Victor Kessler had ordered the power surge, the server access, and the deletion of the morning's maintenance records. The records Bridget had already copied made the admission largely redundant in legal terms, but the words spoken in that parking lot mattered more than the drive in the end. They mattered because they were said out loud, on camera, in the cold air outside a building still trailing smoke, by a man who had understood too late that Victor Kessler was not someone who protected people who failed him. What followed took 3 weeks, but the outcome was already fixed. Investigators traced the bypass authorization through the obsolete facilities account to a communications thread in Victor's email that his lawyers described as ambiguous and prosecutors described as explicit. Financial records connected the false equipment certification to a firm Victor had been directing clients toward for 3 years, an arrangement that had saved the summit significant costs on safety compliance and had never been disclosed to the board. The morning Stefan submitted copies of his 3 original maintenance reports to the investigating committee. The room was quiet in the specific way of people realizing that what they are looking at should not surprise them, but does. Alma attended the committee meeting by video from her office. She had been discharged from hospital after 4 days and had returned to work against medical advice. When the investigators finished presenting the timeline, she asked Stefan directly whether the sensors would have caught the contamination if they had been left active. He said yes. She asked whether the generator could have been repositioned in the time between his first report and the keynote. He said yes. She said she wanted to ask him why he had gone back into the building the second time, after the server room fire, knowing what it would look like. Stefan looked at the table for a moment. He said there were 2 people inside who couldn't get themselves out. Victor Kessler was arrested the following afternoon. He was charged with criminal negligence causing bodily harm, obstruction of justice, falsification of safety records, and breach of fiduciary duty. He stood in the corridor outside the boardroom where the directors were still seated, and not one person who had spent years deferring to him was willing to meet his eyes as the officers walked him past. Alma called Stefan the next morning. She offered a financial settlement, significant, appropriate, the kind of number that acknowledged what had been done to him and to his daughter, and to the rent that had been 3 weeks late after his file was suspended. She offered a formal restoration of his professional record. She offered him a position, Director of Site Safety and Emergency Protocols for the Meridian Health Alliance, a role she said she was creating specifically because the last 4 weeks had demonstrated that such a role had always been necessary and never existed. Stefan said he didn't want the settlement. Alma waited. He said he wanted 3 things. He wanted the summit's safety reporting system restructured so that a contracted worker's hazard notice could not be filtered through a single executive's office. He wanted whistleblower protections written into the vendor agreements for every organization the Alliance partnered with. And he wanted a fund, modest and practical, for workers in short-term technical contracts who lost income while doing exactly what they were supposed to do. Alma said yes to all 3 without pausing. Then she asked him again about the directorship. Stefan was quiet for a moment. He said that after Tatum's mother died, he had chosen smaller jobs deliberately. Jobs that kept him close to home, predictable, present. The kind of work where he knew he would be back for dinner. He said he didn't know if a director's role left room for that. Alma said the role would be built around whatever room it needed to leave. That evening, Stefan sat at the kitchen table while Tatum finished her homework, and he told her about the offer. He told her what the job would mean. The early mornings, the occasional travel, the fact that his vest would be replaced by something with his actual name on it. Tatum put her pencil down and looked at him. She said she didn't need him to be invisible to come home. She said she just needed him to come home. He accepted the position on the condition that his schedule would be structured around school drop-off and pickup, and Alma agreed without negotiating. 6 months later, Stefan Norris stood at the front of the Vantage Grand's restored conference room, leading the first cross-sector emergency safety training the Health Forward Summit had ever held. The participants were not only executives and administrators, they were hotel staff, catering workers, contracted technicians, event support personnel, the people whose names never appeared in the program but whose names Stefan had insisted be on the registration list. Renee ran the practical exercises. Bridget presented the new reporting framework. Tatum sat in the back row with a visitor's badge and a thermos of hot chocolate, watching her father's name on the projector screen. It was the first time it had ever been there. She didn't say anything about it, but she smiled in the private way she had, the one that looked like her mother, and Stefan caught it from across the room and felt something settle in his chest that he didn't have a better word for than grateful. Not for the title, not for the vindication. For the fact that when she looked across a room, she could still find him.